Hello, my name is Greg Madison. Welcome back to The Living Process. And in this episode, I talk with Janis Briedis. Janis has developed a body-oriented form of schema therapy. And we have a conversation about the way that he attends to the body with clients, working with trauma, different modes of working. And sort of, it was interesting to notice how some of his language points to something that we would recognize in focusing oriented therapy, but we would use different language. So there's a little bit of that kind of translating back and forth during the session. And I found it very interesting. I think the concept or the coming of a felt sense is something that may still be unique to our way of working, but a lot of what he talks about, I think, will be really familiar. And the schema approach, I think, offers more of a theoretical background than we typically have in FOT. So I hope you really enjoy this episode. I did. And there will be links and ways of contacting Yanis or seeing more of his work if you'd like to take it further. Okay, welcome back to The Living Process. And my guest for this episode is Janis Briedis. Welcome.
Thank you, Greg. Nice to be here.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're here. And your specialty is in body-oriented schema therapy.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking there's probably going to be quite a bit of crossover to the way a lot of different focusing-oriented therapists would work. Um, and there may be some very interesting differences. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about maybe the schema therapy part of it,
Mhm.
because I'm thinking that may not be as familiar to everyone, depending on how they're working.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try to give a brief intro.
Okay.
I mean, I think the way you could describe schema therapy, it's about parts work. It's this idea that we have multiple selves rather than singular self,
Hmm.
and so we in schema we call it modes, which are basically expressions of different sort of aspects of the self. These are not different cells, of course, but they are sort of different angles, if you like, or um, different ways that aspects of self may show up in different situations, in different relationships. And so that's the kind of the foundational block, one of the foundational blocks of schema work, which overlaps a lot with other approaches, particularly like IFS, internal family systems, which talks about parts. And so we just call parts modes in schema therapy.
Okay. Let me
Um,
just pause there for a second, because that's already interesting to me, because in the focusing world, people often talk about parts. The problem with parts is that they sound quite almost like little entities, quite concretized. So your word modes sounds more process, which appeals to me. It's like the person gets into a particular mode of self. Is that
yeah.
right?
I would say so generally. I think it is a bit of a language issue. I think we're restricted by the words we sometimes use, and I think using word parts can suggest that there is almost like a lack of coherent whole.
Hmm.
Because you're so over-focused on parts of self, you miss the bigger picture. And I think maybe in schema we get away from that a little bit by using a different term, which isn't so widely used maybe in other therapies, but
Hmm.
it does talk more about, I mean, it captures behavior, but also all other aspects of personal experience. It's about our thoughts and feelings and physical sensations.
Hmm.
So it's kind of quite a broad term, the way we understand how one is in one given moment.
Hmm.
Yeah. And we
Interesting.
recognize the fluctuations and that these sort of different modes can feel quite different to the person as well as the others who are witnessing that.
Mm-hmm. Like a person can find themselves slipping into, or we would say in focusing, kind of identifying with
Yeah.
a child mode or a younger
Yeah.
version of themselves or
Yeah.
something, and then acting accordingly.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Okay.
that can be, that can take form in different ways. It could be, if you kind of look at almost like a more sort of clinical examples, you could say it could be a form of dissociation when someone goes into like a child mode, almost sort of reenacting that and feeling very much like a younger person, like a child. But there are different degrees of that. Often our moods can change,
Yeah.
and we're aware of our moods that change. We don't get lost in the mood, but we also find it difficult to just pull ourselves out of that.
Mhm.
It's sort of something that just can happen to us,
Mhm.
but we can still be very much aware of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's something we in schema we understand as a mode shift or mode flip. Different terms we can use for that. But basically, it speaks to the complexity of human beings, right? It's the
Mhm.
understanding that our minds are not just a singular sort of straight road, but we have like different pockets
Yeah.
and different ways of coping and different sort of multiple selves, so to speak, that we can draw on in
Mhm.
different situations.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that sounds really familiar to me. It makes a lot
Mm.
of sense to me. So what else? I interrupted you. What else in terms
Yeah.
of kind of just an overview of a schema approach?
Yeah. So basically, there are four different aspects. So one is modes we talked about. The other one is so I'm doing it a little bit backwards, but that's okay. Sort of back to front. Usually I start from the beginning, but here we're talking about modes. But the other important one is schemas. So schemas are
Okay.
basically these, so hence name the schema therapy. Schemas are basically like life patterns. These are habits that we get into that often develop in early life, typically in childhood, maybe adolescence. These are habitual ways of doing things, of thinking, of feeling, of somatic habits, as well as relating. So these are basically like schemas are like prediction systems that allow us to navigate in quite a complex world, in a sense. And they sometimes we think of them sort of like goggles that we see the world through. Yeah. So like one of those schemas, as an example, might be mistrust.
Mhm.
So the prism that one would see the world through is consciously or not looking for almost like evidence to support that idea that the world is an unsafe place and you need to guard yourself. Yeah. And so when those goggles are on all the time, it becomes a sort of automatic pattern
Mhm.
through which we filter sort of like information and the way we relate to ourselves and others. And usually these are patterns which are sort of not kind of conscious most of the time because they formed a long time ago. And they often get reenacted in different ways in the present time.
So a pattern can have a strong influence on how you experience yourself, but also really influences your perception of the world around you.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, there are different degrees of how strong those filters can be. And of course, like from cognitive science perspective, nobody sees the world in a sense as it is. It's always filtered through our senses. But I guess these are more kind of psychological filters that are added to our perception
Mhm.
that then guide very much our decision making, guide the kind of relationships we get into, guide the sort of things that might be triggering for us, for instance. Yeah, you could also think of them as sort of emotional sensitivity points. Yeah,
Yeah.
schema gets triggered. It's a very painful place usually.
Hmm. Yeah, it's that word schema that seems unique. Everything underneath it that you're describing, it makes an awful lot of sense to me. Although I think there may be a little bit more development in the way that you're talking about it. So a schema develops early in life, typically.
That's how we would think of that. I think you could say schema could possibly develop later in life
Okay.
if there was a sequence of certain events that particularly lead to it developing. So let's say, someone's schema might be in early childhood. Let's say someone who was sort of quite protected as a child.
Hmm.
Their general sense is that the world is a really sort of safe place and everything is good, but they sort of were brought up in a bubble, not really sort of having a sense of the reality of what the world could sometimes be like.
Hmm.
And it can be a shock when you sort of leave very safe home environment in a big world, and then a sequence of bad things happen that, of course, can lead to schema development as well. When you realize, wait a minute, this is not what I learned earlier, and this is very different. How come? And then there are a number of reinforcing sort of like events that could lead to development of schema. But generally speaking, we think of schema as an earlier pattern
Hmm.
that develops as a result of many, 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 many repeated experiences,
Yeah.
not something that develops as a result of one big bang event. It's often like a sort of a treacle effect from many years of certain influences, usually from people around us, from our attachment relationships around us. Children are very sort of susceptible to these experiences, and children's brains are very malleable.
Hmm.
And typically, the younger the child, the stronger the schema will be that will take effect later in life.
Interesting. And the way when you're talking about it, I'm imagining that this is something that gets, this is a clumsy way of saying it, but kind of gets built into the body.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And that's where kind of my interest lies, because in schema we talk a lot about emotional states.
Hmm.
We talk about beliefs. We talk about behaviors. We don't talk enough about the body, and that's been sort of my,
Hmm.
I guess, little contribution, trying to bring in more body into the schema work, because I think body is quite central to all schemas and modes, really.
So adding kind of a basic somatic component to an otherwise more cognitive understanding.
I would say emotion focused.
Okay. Okay.
Although schema therapy it was sort of came out of CBT in the 90s in the USA.
Hmm.
It has, grown into much more sort of an emotion focused model.
Okay.
Um, and I think we have sort of wonderful ways of working with that, and we have techniques that we use which are very powerful, and that's kind of tied together with, uh, I think, a helpful cognitive conceptualization. But I think we need to talk more about the body,
Hmm.
because I think particularly for some people, the experience is more somatic than it is even emotional. Particularly when we work with like pre-verbal
Hmm.
parts, let's say, often we might get strong emotion. We certainly might not get a lot of cognition, but we get an awful lot of somatics in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm interested in that distinction between somatic and emotion. Is that something that you would distinguish?
I think it's an interesting question. I think in kind of schema in schema literature, I think there's a lot of focus on describing emotions, languaging emotions, harnessing emotions, managing emotions. That sort of language.
Hmm.
But I think what's already implied in your question, can we actually separate emotion from sensation?
Yeah.
And I think it's a really good question. And I think a lot of some research that I'm aware of, for example, will say you can't really distinguish them because one will always show up as the other in some way or another.
Hmm. And emotions, uh, I would tend to say are always, but I've been corrected by clients at times. But I would say emotions are always bodily. How do you know you're feeling angry? Well, you feel
Right.
it somewhere. It's there someplace in the body
Yeah.
or around the body or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
However, I, in my clinical practice, I think I'll have maybe similar to you. There will be clients who will find it very uncomfortable talking about their body or going anywhere near the body.
Yes.
So talking about emotions can feel like a better start, a safer starting point.
Hmm.
Um, and yet there's maybe a group which of people who are the opposite, where it's easier to go into the body, but it's very hard to language emotions.
Yeah.
An emotion can feel more like an abstract sort of concept rather than a lived experience.
Yeah.
And it would be interesting to see the differences and similarities between people. But anyway, that's not, I guess, where we're going today.
Mm.
Um, but it's a really good question, and I think it's definitely worth reflecting on.
So I'm curious a little bit more, sort of your body emphasis. How does that show up in your way of working?
It shows up in different ways.
Yeah.
Um, I'm just sort of thinking where to begin to answer the question because there are so many different angles you can take. Same as I think when you begin to work with the body, it can feel like you sometimes opening a can of worms.
Mm.
There could be so much there, and it can be so much information you don't know where to start and what to filter out, what to focus on. So in schema, generally we have sort of fairly clear sort of cognitive framework, if you like. We do conceptualization based on modes most of the time, called mode mapping, and that will include description usually of some emotional states, like particularly when we think about more raw emotions, we think of what we call child modes. So these are basically, it's a metaphor for, I guess, they're part of experience in oneself where a lot of the pain is carried. Yeah, so a lot of the difficult emotions that bring people to therapy. So that will be the kind of the starting point. And so where I might add the body to that is thinking about the somatic experience of, let's say, one entry point could be when you get triggered,
Hmm.
when you experience emotional pain, what happens in your body.
Hmm.
And I think that can be a valuable addition to the repertoire that's already available, where I think when we talk about the body, it can be a helpful resource. It can be a place of safety. It can be also a place of traumas. So some people wouldn't want to go anywhere near the body because going in the body is like revisiting like a trauma site.
Yeah.
And that would create a lot of avoidance for people. Why would I want to do that?
Hmm.
I don't feel safe to go in there. Same as some people wouldn't feel safe to go into their emotions. So the body can be used in multiple ways. So I think we can address trauma directly in the body. I think we can look at somatic patterns in the body. In terms of by somatic patterns, I mean, how do schemas and modes manifest themselves somatically? And then I think body can be the point of experimentation, if you like, where we can play around
Hmm.
with different ways of being somatically, which can then directly change how one experiences themselves inside emotionally and also cognitively. And of course, the third aspect I mentioned is the resourcing. I think body can be, I think we can help people feel safe in their bodies with sort of gentle exploration and what we would call sort of somatic resourcing work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear some examples of kind of maybe what it would look like in a session doing some of the things you've just been describing.
With somatic resourcing, maybe just to give a few very simple examples, it could be something like a client who is arriving at the session feeling very sort of dysregulated, feeling chaotic inside, maybe very triggered. Something has just happened, or they've just had a bad week. They have a tough time grounding themselves, and they talk a lot at you.
Hmm. Yeah.
There's a lot of words, but you kind of get the content, but um, it's not. It doesn't help create a sense of peace or inner stability or connection. So that would be a moment I might ask client to just slow down and pause, maybe notice, um, take a deep breath. That's a very, very simple example. Sometimes get up from the chair and move around the room.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes clients, particularly who may have a tough time to ground themselves or be in their body, I invite them to sit on the floor with me or lean against a wall.
Mm-hmm.
So some of this, so it gives a kind of broader vocabulary of what we can do in the session. So it's not just, the way when I was trained anyway, the kind of the implication, even if we're not told, this is your chair, this is a client's chair, and you sort of stick with that. This is your little safe corner, and you operate from that, and then hopefully you create a connection with sort of two minds exchanging words. When you use the body, the repertoire, it's much, much wider.
Yeah.
You can move around. You don't need to be in the same. You don't need to be in the room. You can be walking outside.
Mm-hmm.
You could be doing some movement together. You could be using wall to create a sense of groundedness and stability and safety sort of behind you. So it can be really creative and actually playful and fun as well.
So these are examples of resourcing, kind of helping
Mm.
the client find a space from which they can relate or reflect or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the repertoire goes much wider. It depends on what are you dealing with at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that if you are, for example, and goes a little bit beyond just resourcing, but one of the ideas in schema work is that when we work with younger parts, we use this idea of limited reparenting. And that's quite a kind of key concept in schema where we try to create a positive experience for the younger part where they can feel safe, where they can feel connected to in a safe way. They can be seen, the needs can be understood,
Yeah.
and we can demonstrate directly how their needs could be met in a limited sense. That's why it's limited reparenting. But you can add somatic anchors, somatic resources to that. Like, let's say if we have a sort of a session with a client where we dive deep into the younger self, and part of reparenting process could be, where do you feel your younger self in the body? And I feel this pain in my chest.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what would it want? It wants some connection. And then might guide client towards, what if you put your hand on your chest right now? And we can play around with that a little bit. See, does that help right now when you put your hand here, and just sit with that for a while? So this could be another example of sort of being quite proactive in
Mm-hmm.
a sense as a therapist, and inviting client to be quite proactive, and being quite playful and experimenting to say, okay, maybe this is not the right thing, but maybe something else might work. Maybe something else might help and create that sense of connectedness and letting your younger self know they're not alone right now.
Yeah. Again, that sounds very familiar to me. And it reminds me of in the tradition I come from, Gene Gendlin wrote a paper called The Client's Client,
Mm,
and how you work with the client sort of to begin to, as you're saying, this limited reparenting, where you're helping the client kind of begin to relate to their own inner parts or modes as a client.
mm, mm,
So they begin to fill in kind of the parenting that wasn't there
mm,
in the present. So that sounds really familiar to me.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How,
I'm sure there are similar ideas in lots of therapies, because
yeah,
essentially it's about learning to embrace
yeah.
and take care of your vulnerability in the most gentle, respectful possible way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think now that the body has finally begun to appear in psychotherapy, there's a lot of different people are taking it in different ways, but there's as you say, an awful lot of similarity, even though the language can be quite different.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, you said something a little while ago about I can't remember how you said it, but it made me think that with working with a client, you come to recognize some of the schema, some of what what they're kind of carrying in terms of limiting beliefs or whatever it is.
Mhm.
And then what my question is, how would you work with that bodily? Do you invite them to kind of notice how their body feels in a particular situation and then sort of teasing out what are you believing there? Or wondering.
Yeah, that would definitely be one way to approach that. Um, so, there are different ways of doing it.
Yeah,
I think in my mind, it's quite helpful to sort of have this idea of top down and bottom up ways of working.
yeah.
And I think in schema we can do both. Sometimes it can be top down when we have explored some of the modes
Mhm.
and we sort of describe them cognitively first. And well, as a therapist, we begin to observe the client,
Mhm.
what happens in their body when they shift, when they mode flip, the kind of concept I mentioned before.
Yeah.
So that could be one way to approach that, and then work your way through that and see and study that in more depth and see what happens and how it feels inside. What are the somatic components of that mode? Or we can sort of do it more sort of starting bottom up and noticing movements in the body, noticing gestures, noticing posture, noticing, micro changes that might be going on that we attune to and gently feed back to the client and then see what happens with that. And generally we will try to link them at some point to
Mhm.
the kind of more sort of higher level cognitive sort of ideas of, well, like which mode might it belong to, or what schema might be manifesting here. But again, there are different ways of doing it, different pace of doing that.
Yeah.
With some people, it's very much a kind of bottom up approach, very much hanging out there at the bottom.
Mhm.
And some people might struggle with that to get into the body straight away and might struggle with me feeding back. So we kind of start more from the top, going down, drilling into it.
So let me just say that back to you. I think I get that. That there's one way is to almost map the territory a little bit so that you can notice when something is alive and you can refer back to the map, sort of.
Yeah.
The other way is to work more immediately with the body so that you discover kind of what that particular unique person is manifesting. And then again, you would link that to sort of areas of the map, different modes, for example. So I'm thinking in your way of working, you delineate general modes that are common for people.
Generally we think of, so I would be looking for certain modes that are fairly universal,
Yeah,
and then there are variations of those modes that are idiosyncratic.
yeah, exactly.
And I think what's important is with the process of sort of connecting the top down and bottom up is, I think, the flexible movement between them. Um, and again, that's coming from my own experience and also working with many clients. I think both are important where you do the sort of body work
Mhm.
and you can feel there's a shift and you found maybe a somatic alternative to the usual ways of doing something. Let's say you change your posture from sort of usual hunch position to something a bit more upright, and then you kind of explore that and stay with that, and that's very helpful. But what I find is important is to see if you can hook it into something cognitive, as in how is this helpful? So it's like a bit like, sometimes I use an analogy when I teach this. I talk about the lift that's going up and down.
Mm.
So the lift between the cognitive brain that's kind of questioning what's happening here to the body that's busy with a certain kind of process. And I think that movement between the two is important so that the cognitive brain can also catch up at some point, or maybe at that exact point, but it's important it can catch up at some point to make sense of what just happened in the body. And
Interesting.
I find, at least with the people I tend to work with, I think that feels like an important anchor that can pin things to the map that they have in the roadmap of the kind of self, in a sense, that we have mapped out, as well as the goals of therapy and why we're even here, why we're doing this stuff.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the question that I have in my mind as I listen to you is I have no doubt that the way of working that you're describing leads to change for people. But I'm curious, how do you understand that change? What sort of makes change happen from your point of view in your way of working?
Are you referring to somatic work in particular, or all of it?
All of it, but I guess I'm thinking from your point of view, the body component is really important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Again, I think there are different elements to that. I think if we start with top down, the easier one probably in some respect, I think helping people language parts of their experience and create some kind of structured way of seeing what's happening with them, making sense of it.
Mhm.
I think part of that is, of course, normalizing, contextualizing, um, seeing how these patterns fit into their life, sort of their life experience, their upbringing,
Mhm.
familial networks, cultural networks, all that kind of stuff. I think it's helpful to create those kind of cognitive hooks that makes you feel like you're not just some random crazy person. Everything that happens inside makes total sense
Mhm.
because everything you experience is a result of something that happened before. And so that kind of cognitive umbrella, I think, is quite holding for people. And that's a change in itself, I think, already for people to create some kind of clarity, bring some kind of cognitive order, if you like, a little
Mhm.
bit
Yeah.
in some that might otherwise feel really chaotic, overwhelming experience that feels beyond comprehension, explanation.
Mhm.
But I think in terms of kind of more bottom-up ways of working, I think it's about um, making little changes in the body that and part of the change could be firstly just allowing yourself to be with your experience
Mhm.
and witnessing it in a way that doesn't need to run away from it, in a way that allows you to stay with it, be curious, to tolerate it and to know that you can tolerate it, and ultimately to be able to sort of embrace it in a kind of compassionate sense.
Yeah.
And then, from that place, you can make little changes that might happen in your body. So, like when, you can see when someone has done a, sufficient amount of somatic sort of trauma work, there's a visible change in their body, but there's also change in energy.
Mhm.
Yeah, sort of energy is not sort of consumed
Mhm.
by trauma sort of based or trauma driven patterns
Yeah.
that are designed to survive, which are extremely taxing for the client system.
Mhm.
And when you see when that energy is finally diverted somewhere else, when it's being discharged, you can see this kind of sense of opening up,
Mhm.
expansion, those kind of usual words that you often hear in somatic different therapies, I suppose. And then that allows change to happen, that it kind of coming out of a narrow sort of narrow repertoire, if you like, a very tiny, tight space, you can explore other options.
Mhm.
It gives you the possibility of giving yourself permission to be different
Yeah.
in different situations in your life and with different relationships. It gives you the opportunity to explore, to dare to explore.
Mhm. And it sounds like you didn't quite say this, but I think you were implying it that um, sometimes through this work, you find you already are different.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
sometimes, just like you were also saying, sometimes just by being able to name what's happening, that already feels very different.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think there's something else. Maybe I think maybe the question why I'm passionate about working in the body. I think because
Mm.
um, I think a lot of my own healing process happened through the body because I have you could say I have quite an active brain, and I can tell myself stories, and I have plenty of clients who do the same.
Yeah.
They're really, really good storytellers, and they can tell stories till cars come home. And you kind of, and I had that experience in my own therapy in the past. I kind of feel like I filled a session with words, and I don't feel any different.
Hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. And I think there's something about going in the body, and that's, I think, part of the healing process as well. You sort of, is it okay to swear a little bit here?
Yes, I
Yeah.
don't mind you swearing.
I sometimes think that our cognitive brains create layers of bullshit
Uh-huh.
that I think is, you can't bullshit when you're in your body.
Hmm. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't spin yet another story when you allow yourself to authentically go in your body. And that's, I think, this is the power of going beyond the narrative,
Hmm.
where you sort of like, I don't want to be too dramatic about it, but I know Alice Miller used those similar words. You kind of, you found your truth in your body, in a sense.
Hmm.
Your
Yeah.
most authentic truth that you possibly can gain access to, I think, is often found in the body.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
You put all the stories aside, eventually it gets quiet inside, and then you're deep inside your body and you're really in connection. And it's just a different way of being. And it is something that can be difficult to describe in words. Sometimes when I teach body stuff, often to very cognitively orientated therapists who
Yeah.
might struggle initially with that, thinking, well, there's nothing happening. It's like, oh, it's really slow, or you don't say very much. And I say, yeah, exactly. That's the point.
Hmm.
You put all your kind of wordy bullshit notes on the side for a minute and just be, just allows you to be with what's there, client's experience, your own experience. And then from that place, you notice what happens.
Hmm.
And trust me, there's always going to be a lot of information. Yeah, you never end up with nothing. There's always a lot, but it has a different quality of being. I
Yes.
know that's your experience of working with the body, but
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing that I was thinking as I was listening to you, one thing is getting in touch with what's happening in the body. It almost requires being ready to tell yourself the truth.
yeah,
But the other thing that I was thinking that felt more important was just if you can, like exactly as you were saying, if you can bring a particular attitude to the body, give your body a particular kind of environment. And in therapy, the therapist is a big part of that. Then just by being with the body does begin to change. It doesn't need to be changed. It can just with that kind of company, that kind of attention, and that kind of pausing and that kind of space and not talking all of the time, you can notice the body already is kind of pushing for its own right direction or something.
right. I like the idea of EMDR, this concept that the mind has its own natural ability to heal itself
Yes.
if only we can get out of the way
Yeah.
of the healing process. And I think this is basically, in a nutshell, what I feel we're trying to do with the body is to clear the path to body needing to allow the body to do what it needs to do.
Yeah, definitely.
And if you look at a lot of the kind of trauma sort of literature, like Peter Levine describing this idea that, for example, animals in the nature, they typically animal won't go into shame or guilt reaction about, oh, it's like, oh, what's happening in my body? This is wrong. Maybe I'm going crazy. This should not be happening. Quickly get me some medication, you know. Uh, so animals after trauma, they will go and shake, they will vibrate, they will do whatever, they will let the body do what needs to
Yeah.
happen.
Yes.
And the trauma energy gets discharged naturally. We humans, of course, add tons and tons of layers to it. We start thinking about it. What does it mean? Why is it happening? Maybe there's something really wrong with me. Maybe you need to go and see another doctor. All those kind of layers that we of fear and anxiety and shame and guilt that we add to it. Of course, all of that gets in the way. So part of, I think, the way I see that, what we do as body workers, we navigate around that. We
Yeah,
clear the path and hopefully allow the client to connect with a sort of primary bodily experience.
exactly. And I guess at times also begin to unravel the part of oneself that wants to censor what needs to happen.
Right, that's all part of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like,
Should I feel this? Should I not feel this?
exactly,
Is it normal?
exactly.
Yeah.
What's wrong with me that I feel this way? Or if I
Right.
if I express this, I'll get kicked out of the family or whatever.
Mm, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Or if I do this, I will be restrained. Others will think
Yeah, yeah.
there's something really wrong with me.
Yeah.
So I can't show that.
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
safe. Yeah.
Can I just ask, I mean, what you're saying just sounds spot on to me. I'm wondering how kind of as a therapist you might work relationally with a client in this way and maybe included in that is what, if any, role would your own body have?
Mm. I think that's a fantastic question because that's something I think can be easily forgotten about.
Yeah,
That, the client's body is not the object we're just observing. We are very much creating a space, relational space with the client, with our body being part of that space.
exactly.
And so I think looking from schema perspective, we think of therapeutic relationship as the core of the work and absolutely core. The relationship is the glue that binds together a lot of what we do. A lot of people who come to see us will have a relational trauma one way or another. So the first thing that kind of goes without saying really is to create a safe environment for people where they can feel safe to explore whatever it is that comes up, sort of related to the previous point. And I think part of creating safety is us therapists being aware of how we are in our bodies,
Yeah,
being aware that our body and client's body are already in a conversation without our cognitive minds realizing that
yeah,
or being able to verbalize directly, understand it. Or one of my teachers, body teachers, Janina Fisher, talked about how there's a kind of nervous system to nervous system conversation going on all the time when we're in a room, and so that's always there, and I think with just our presence, we can very much influence
hmm
what happens,
hmm
and if we have parts in us that might be there's stuff going on for ourselves, or we not, or it's really hard for us to find our own center, or we're distracted, or we're not in our own body for some reason, that will have a direct effect on a client. So
yeah,
part of the important part of the trainings, sometimes when to talk to people on trainings, is how do you safely connect to your own body?
exactly.
Because we use
While
this,
while while you're being a therapist, you mean?
yes,
Yeah,
yeah, well, generally, I
yeah,
think
yeah, yeah, yeah. Generally,
you can't help someone to be more safely embodied if you're not embodied yourself. It's just it's anathema, right?
yeah,
So I think the work always starts with ourselves and just being almost like a. Well, sometimes we use this idea of healthy adult in schema, which is this again metaphor for like core self or this sort of a sense of unified self that is able to take care of all the other parts of self, all the other modes. Yeah. So that's a kind of, the textbook name is healthy adult, but you can use any other description of that. But this is the idea that it's the kind of the self that you come back to. And so my view is that this self is always an embodied self ultimately. We cannot be disembodied and be in our true self
hmm
because the two don't go together. So usually when we are not embodied, that tells us we are in a coping mode, what we call the
yeah,
coping mode.
yeah,
And so we're in a kind of some sort of defensive reaction because being embodied doesn't feel safe or right for whatever reason that might be, which then needs to be explored. But yeah, maybe to answer your question, I think I would use my body as a sort of source of information.
hmm
It's about what might be going on between us, what might be going on for the client.
yeah,
Um, and so, for example, sometimes I would, again, with certain clients that you have enough trust with, a good rapport with, I would bring that directly into the room and I would say, you're telling me this really interesting story, but in my body, I'm finding it really hard to focus and connect with this. Can we just pause for a minute and notice? It might be just me, I don't know, but I wonder what's happening for you right now. And those are the moments of little moments of bravery and courage when it's a bit of a therapeutic risk to say, maybe, my critic will say it's because you're not listening carefully enough, or because you're distracted in, whatever, you're not a good listener. But actually, when I put that aside and I tune in and then I might use it as one way or another part of information that might be useful. One session particularly, I mean, I've done it many times. One session comes to mind when client was quite sort of shocked by my honesty, but it also led to this quite amazing conversation where both of us suddenly dropped in a totally different level of depth. And we said, "Thank you for saying that. It's painful, but I felt exactly the same." And I think it does take a bit of, I think, being able to tune into yourself and trusting that it might be. I think how we feed it back is important, of course, and the timing is important.
Yeah.
But I think using that as information is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was wondering as you were talking whether you would use any kind of self-disclosure.
Mm,
And that sounds really important to me. And I guess the therapist needs to have some sense. They don't have to be um, to not have any active modes, but they need to be able to be in relationship with them rather than be in
right,
them
right,
and acting out of them.
right.
Like as you
Absolutely.
call it, the sort of the healthy adult, they need to
Mm,
have some grounding there in order to use their responses
mm,
um, sensitively with the
mm,
client. Is that
mm.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
But a healthy adult is this point of observation rather than being lost in
Yes,
it.
exactly. I was thinking in my language, I would simply use the word awareness or presence or self in presence or something like that, that I think is talking about the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think in schema we tend to be probably we use more sort of jargon, if you like, but effectively we are as I'm learning more from you now, it seems like we are talking a lot about the same things,
Hmm.
just slightly different language, different concepts, but effectively the journey is the same.
Yes, and I think you're right. I think focusing oriented therapy, I don't think gives a person as much theory as the schema approach. I think you're given a body of knowledge that's accrued over time,
Mm,
I imagine from practice.
mm,
And in the focusing world, that happens, but it's held very lightly, and a lot of the language is quite everyday language. Um, but I agree with you. I think there's a usefulness in being able to offer a kind of a map,
mm,
and then clients can adjust it so that it fits with them.
mm,
Um, but the other thing, I'm aware of time. We're coming up to um, an hour. But one thing I wanted to ask, because you just sort of hinted at it again, is whether working in this way as a sort of body informed or body oriented schema therapist, if you do kind of have your own sessions or have an experiential practice that sort of keeps your own awareness alive.
yeah, well, uh, I guess that's where my own journey started in a sense. I've had lots of therapy in my time,
Hmm.
talking therapy, but also I've had I've done, good amount of work in other ways.
Hmm.
So I would say one of my sort of therapy spaces was the dance floor.
Hmm. Yeah.
And some people may find it surprising, but so when we talk about like intuitive movement practices like five rhythms, open floor, ecstatic dance, things like that, I have found it often even more valuable
Yeah.
than talking therapy because again, a lot of, and that's not the case for everyone, but I know for myself, I do a lot of processing in my body.
Hmm.
When something happens in my system, the first place I will feel it in is my body.
Yeah.
And therefore, it makes sense that when I want to shift something, I would also use my body.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that can be done in lots of different ways. And definitely one of them has been movement practice that I've been doing for, it must be more than 15 years on and off, where, when energy feels stuck, I go and dance.
Mm.
And so, and this kind of dancing would be intuitively getting in the body and be guided by the body.
Hmm.
There are no steps to learn, so you're completely out of your cognitive brain. You're completely out of all the shoots. When you learn to dance, I don't know, foxtrot or waltz, you have a idea in your head how all the steps should be,
Yeah.
and you learn that it's very cognitively led.
Yeah.
When you do intuitive practice, you have none of that at all. So it's entirely body led,
Yeah.
and it's amazing what can happen within your body as well as in the relational field with other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that could be one thing. Another thing that I also do, still do, is touch being again very important part of my own journey,
Hmm.
exploring. I have learned to do massage and different touch therapies in the past. That's kind of more sort of in the background earlier.
Hmm.
But something I've been doing now for quite a while is craniosacral therapy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's another thing that I have found, again, helps me deeply touch with, I guess, parts of self through the touch of another.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's been such an amazing, very deep and profound experience. It's just another way to explore touch
Hmm.
and what can happen in the body in that kind of process with someone else. And I've done quite a lot of body focused therapy in the past. I'm not in it right now, so I draw on other practices, but that option is always open.
Yeah.
And I think that's all of those and other things maybe we don't have time to explore in depth, but there are so many ways of getting into the body, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
And some of it can be done very much kind of bottom up, very sort of movement oriented touch. But I think where I've come to is that I think at least for me, I need a more cognitive integration. I need a little cognitive cap
Hmm.
to see, okay, so had this amazing thing happen to me. What was that?
Hmm.
How does that fit in the bigger scheme? How is that useful? Can I use it again in some kind of conscious form? And I think this is where
Right.
the idea of lift going up and down is important. You can find a hook if you need it to
Yeah.
access that and use it in a more conscious way.
Yeah. Yeah. You want to be able to integrate it into your story of yourself
Right,
usefully,
right, right.
not impose it upon yourself, but integrate it in a way that it's accessible
Mm,
again.
yeah.
Makes sense to me. And yeah, it sounds like you take your own personal growth seriously and
Mm.
playfully, perhaps.
I think playfulness is definitely part of that.
Yeah.
I think basically a lot of body work is about trying things out and seeing what happens. Because you're not guided by the cognitive brain.
Yeah.
You can't predict. You don't know what will happen.
Yeah.
You just
Exactly.
have to kind of go into it. You have to trust the process
Yeah.
and trust that something good will come out of that.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much always the case. If you just allow it to
Yeah.
flow,
Yeah. Yeah.
it takes you somewhere good and useful.
Exactly. And you're flowing in the right direction if the body feels at least a little bit more expansive or a little
Mm,
bit more light or free or
mm,
something. It's that kind of feeling, isn't it, that comes
mm.
from the
Yeah,
body's
absolutely.
own direction. Uh,
And the body becomes the source of joy and connection. And,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if you find this, I find that often clients and myself have to be reminded to really stay a long time with a good feeling.
Mm,
Good
yeah,
feelings are often kind of skipped over, looking for what's the next trouble I can deal with.
exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually an important part of body work that I would do is actively encouraging clients to stay longer with a good feeling,
Yeah, me too.
because that's often the uncomfortable bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask one last thing before we
Sure.
finish that I hadn't even thought of asking, but just as you were talking, it came up. Um, would you use touch when you're working with a client, physical touch as well?
I would
Hmm.
carefully, sparingly, um, with consent in mind, of
Hmm.
course.
Yeah,
It's not something I would use a lot, but I think sometimes not using touch could be by not using touch we miss out
hmm,
on something very, very important with particular clients.
yeah,
I think sometimes not using any form of or refusing to touch can also feel like either we are scared or that clients might feel we're neglecting them.
yeah,
Not that it is our job to prove anything, of course, but I think it can add a whole new wonderful dimension to therapy. But I think it can be a painful topic for lots of different reasons. It's a contentious topic because of, I think, litigious sort of culture that we live in sometimes.
yeah,
So I think it can be done beautifully, but it needs to be used very thoughtfully, carefully.
yeah,
I work a lot online these days, so more than I do in person. So that's not possible. But where it's not possible, I would encourage client to use self-touch.
yeah, exactly.
And I think that could be a wonderful alternative. Also, using things like scarf, holding something together can be, or maybe sitting next to each other, can almost sort of approximate that sort of sense of being touched, but without the completing the act in a sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I think my guess is that people that watch this podcast they're not going to be freaked out by the idea of touch. Whether they use it or
Yeah.
not, I think most people are really open to that as a
Mm,
possibility.
yeah. Right.
Yeah. Can I just ask, is there anything else that I maybe should have asked or anything else you feel passionate about that you'd like to mention?
I think I think we've covered a lot today,
Yeah, me too.
and this conversation made me, I guess, think more deeply about what I do and why,
Mhm.
and how I convey to people that I train and why. And I think I think being interviewed by someone who's not in the schema world is a fantastic thing because you ask questions that many people in the world wouldn't think of asking because we kind of know the language or we take it for granted. I think it's fantastic to step back a little and say, yeah, why do we do it this way?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
been super helpful for me actually to reflect on it.
Okay. For me as well, because it makes me reflect on my own practice
Mm,
and notice that I am doing some things I hadn't realized I was doing.
mm. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I suppose I was sort of again I've done a little bit of training with you in focusing, but I'm not too familiar with it.
Mhm.
But I think ultimately there's so much similarity
Yeah.
between what we do as well as many other approaches.
Yeah.
It's just a question of what language you use, how much structure you add or don't. But I think that ultimately the goals are the same.
Yes.
Yeah, we're sort of guiding clients towards safe embodiment
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
and sort of embracing all parts of self.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's things that you've said that could easily be integrated into a focusing way of working.
Mm.
Um, So I will put in the show notes different links so people can find you. And I know that you run
Thank you.
courses.
That'd be great.
Yeah. And yeah, people that are interested in hearing more, they'll be able to find you. That's important.
Yeah. Well, it's been a real joy. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much for making
Okay.
time to do this.
Real pleasure.
Okay. See you soon.
Okay. See
Yeah.
you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.